Really happy to be here. I traveled this morning from Amsterdam with my two assistants here today who will help me during this lecture. And I'm also really happy to be here and talk about the big question, is politics too emotional or not emotional enough? I'm especially happy to talk about that because this semester I'm teaching first year statistics, which is a really boring topic to teach, and the students hate it. So it's nice to be talking about something a bit more lively. And so I hope tonight will be more entertaining for you than talking about t-tests in Pearson's R. There's one similarity though between this class of statistics and this room. Nobody sits on the first row, nobody. And actually these are the best chairs because nobody ever sits in them. You should try it next time maybe. Okay. So, if we go way back in history, we go back to the times of Plato and Aristotle. If you read those writings of them, you can almost read it as if these are today's newspapers, because already they were very concerned about the role of emotions in politics and how emotions would block us, indeed, as Job has introduced the topic, from following a more rational form of politics. At the same time, they also acknowledge a particular role of emotions in politics. It's almost inevitable that politicians would use emotional appeals, and that in processing politics, citizens also experience emotions. Now, what I'll do today is, starting from Plato and Aristotle, fast forwarding to today, is what I'm trying to do for you today is talk you through a range of rather different research questions that the people in my lab work on. And so we'll talk about some concrete research. Some of it might be a little bit too technical. I'm sorry for this, but there's also Q&A, and so I'm also very open to answer any of your questions about the specifics of the research we do. As Job also announced, it will be a tour through more standard psychological work, but also more neuroscientific work and computational science work, in addition to, of course, my own discipline, which is political science. Yes? Okay, now I need my notes, so I have to walk all the way back here to see where I was in my story. Yes. So, if we talk about Aristotle, Plato, Spinoza, Mill, Hobbes, and we take it to these days, we can, for example, zoom in on a thinker like Karl Popper, who wrote this famous book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. And this is a philosopher who very clearly articulates how dangerous emotions can be in democracy. So, just to read out loud this particular quote, it says, if a dispute arises, then this means that those more constructive emotions and passions, which might in principle help to get over it, reverence, love, devotion to a common cause, etc., have shown themselves to be incapable of solving the problem. There are only two solutions. One is the use of emotions and ultimately of violence. And the other is the use of reason or impartiality of reasonable compromise. Very similar. Oh, I'm missing a slide here. Huh? Oh, oops. Maybe one of them deleted it accidentally. A very similar philosopher, which should have been the next slide, is Martha Nussbaum. Much more a contemporary philosopher, who in her recent work has severely criticized how, for example, anxiety has a very adverse effect on the quality of democracy. And that ultimately it has very similar consequences to what Popper said here. It is going to be bad. Emotions are bad. The problem, however, of emotions is that we cannot turn them off. There's no remote control to your emotions. And in politics, this works two ways. One, you as a citizen, you can't just turn off your emotions. You may think you're acting rational, but in fact, neurologically, in everything you do, your emotions are involved. Very quickly, milliseconds after you've received a certain stimulus, emotional processes in your brain are active. And so they are always interfering with the higher cognitive functioning of your brain. So there's always going to be some sort of emotion involved. So that's one. But on the other end, you have the politician. You have the system that is communicating to you as a citizen. And at the political level, they know, of course, that if I appeal to the emotions of the people, I might be very successful. If I make them angry, they might do what I want them to do. And so also from that level, emotions are communicated to you. And so what I'm going to argue today is that because we cannot turn off emotions, I mean, there's no red button in your brain where you do this, we should rather embrace them and make sure that we use emotions in a smart and informed way, and so in a way that would ultimately support democracy. Now, I'm going to disappoint you a bit here, is that ultimately this is the question how we should do that, how we should use emotions to improve the functioning of democracy is a very, very, very large question. And I'm only 42, so I haven't answered this question yet. But what I have done so far in my research, and I will present that to you today, is that a couple of ideas we have about how emotions function in democracy are wrong. And so I'm going to present some work on this. In addition to that, I'm going to share with you a couple of the ideas we have, my team and I have, to thinking how we can use emotions to indeed improve the functioning of democracy. Or at least make sure that they don't make things worse. So one reason why we need emotions is that ultimately emotions prepare us for action. So emotions ensure that we turn out for elections. We find it important to turn out for elections. We have feelings about candidates, and positive feelings about the candidate we want to vote for, negative feelings about the candidate that might become the largest if we don't turn out to vote. So it motivates us to come out and vote on election day. They also motivate us to search for information, for example. Anxiety is a very strong motivation to search for information. Maybe not always the right information, but at least it makes us interested into politics. So there you have two examples of emotions stimulating us to become politically active. Now, so I'm not going to argue that emotions are wrong. I'm going to argue that we should regulate them. So don't push the red button, but we should regulate our emotions. So think about changing the channel. Think about changing the volume. What more do you have on the remote control? Well, that's basically change the volume or change the channel. And so that we are going to watch a particular channel and with a particular volume on our TV that is helpful for how we engage with our democratic behavior. Okay. So this is a bit of a complex scheme, but I want to emphasize here that there are different ways of thinking about emotions and democracy. So there's, of course, in the middle you see emotions. And what are emotions? Well, there are a lot of different definitions of emotions. And in my research, we make use of these differences. So one particular definition of emotions is as follows. It says, emotions are episodic, relatively short-term, biologically based patterns of And here it comes: perception, experience, physiology, action, and communication that occur in response to specific physical and social challenges and opportunities. So if we speak of political emotions, these are emotions, responses to political stimuli. And these can be politicians who give speeches, engage in debates, write tweets. But it could also be policies. We also have emotional responses to policies. And so that's all clustered on the left, and the environment produces certain stimuli. And today I will talk very briefly about how emotional political communication is. I will talk more about the middle part. What sort of emotions do we actually have about politics? Because this is actually quite complicated. I emphasize this part where I said there are these 5 different elements. There are experiences, physiological changes, neurological changes. And the difficulty is that these things don't always align. And so that what we feel may not be the same as what our body is experiencing. And this is potentially problematic. And I will talk a lot about that today. Then the other line you see in the middle is emotions leading to certain behavior. And so ultimately there is behavior in terms of trying to behave in a way that suits democracy. And that is, of course, turnout, but it's also reasoning about politics. How you have conversations about politics. And then there are more ways that emotions come back in politics, and that's through the individual characteristics in on the bottom of this slide. The way we respond to politics also is moderated by, for example, the identities we have, the political identities we have. And so you can see political identities as a set of saved emotional experiences about politics. And so this is also a way that emotions come back into politics. So there's sort of the more long-term identities, there's the political communication, and there's the very short-term, immediate responses to what we see in our environment. The top part I'm not going to talk about, but that's about that we experience different emotions if, for example, we are on social media versus watching a debate on television versus being part of an audience. Yeah, that also moderates how we experience politics. Oh. Okay, so I already mentioned that for me, emotions is not one thing. There are several different aspects of emotions, and it's maybe best not to talk even about emotions, but rather about emotion processes. And so very quickly after receiving a stimulus, our body starts to respond to this. And so in the research I've done, there's a lot of emphasis on trying to measure these very quick responses by looking at physiological changes in your body. And part of these physiological changes are in your face, right? You smile if you like something, and you frown if you don't like something. And so this activity can be measured. You can see that on the doll face there with these black electrodes. They measure the physical, the activity in that particular muscle area. And so I'm going to talk a bit about research where we've used these things. And on the other end, you see skin conductance. And so this is if you get slightly aroused. Basically the metaphorical explanation is that you start to sweat a little bit on your fingertips, on your hands, and this is then measured by these black electrodes that you see there. So that's a very bodily version of measuring emotions. But there's also the more experiential version, and I want to emphasize that I didn't make this slide, but my daughter made it, Julia, during the pandemic, when basically I had to teach and watch the kids at the same time. And so she made this slide for me. simply to express that we can also study emotions as these labels that we give to them, like anger or sadness, fear. Oops. But if we talk about the process, this is of course much later into the process. So first these physiological, neurological changes come, and then ultimately this leads us to express a particular emotion. Oh, I feel very angry. And of course this can lead to feedback processes where this expression of anger can lead also your body again to change, and maybe you change your labeling again. So this is ultimately what is called a so-called recursive process. And it's quite difficult to capture because in all these different elements might not actually align. So my body may be producing lots of signals that I'm angry, but I may not be willing or capable to express this because this situation doesn't feel like you could express this anger. And of course in politics this is very likely to occur. There are lots of these so-called social desirability biases where you're not supposed to show emotions, or you're not supposed to give particular or use particular emotion labels. So I was in this bookstore here in Maastricht, the one in the church, and there was this. We were in the children's department. There's this children's comic book. It's called Democracy, and so I picked it up, and it's a really nice book actually, and it's in Dutch, but I guess the author I think wasn't Dutch, so I guess it exists in other languages too. But it's partially about explaining the political system, but also about how you should behave in the political system. So it's actually very similar to some of the research I do, like what is proper democratic behavior. And so one of the boxes in the book was about conversations about politics, and the first thing it says is like, you're not supposed to be angry in a discussion about politics. So there we have it, like a very normative expression of how we should express our emotions in politics. I thought this was pretty wild and pretty bizarre. I mean, there are pretty crazy things happening in politics right now. Should we stay not angry about this? It's kind of bizarre. Okay, that's just an example. All right. Okay, this was the introduction. Job also said this, like I'm going to debunk a couple of myths, at least that's how I formulated it 4 months ago. But I'm going to talk about 3 topics: polarization, mostly, very little about populism, and then about a word you might not be familiar with, political alexithymia. So alexithymia is a neurological condition that you are not well capable of describing your own feelings or recognizing the feelings in other people. And what I mean with the term political alexithymia is that we might not be very good at understanding each other's emotions about politics or our own emotions. And this is a problem. And then at the very end, I'm going to talk a bit about how we can use emotions for the good. Yeah, I'll get there. After a 25-minute introduction. Okay, very briefly on this. So this is about one of the, a couple of articles we've written, research we've done. And what is of course very prevalent in politics is that we think in terms of in-groups and out-groups. So the in-group is basically the people you are politically, you have the same political views, and the out-group would be people who oppose your political views. And in politics, of course, this is conceptualized also as a party you vote for, and then parties that oppose this party, and then there's conflict in the debates on television or in parliament. Now, our question was, if you see someone from the out party, how do you respond to this person? compared to how you would respond to a normal person, and compared to how you would respond to someone from your in-party. And we were also interested in, are there differences between these three categories, depending on whether these people are smiling, frowning, or having a neutral look. Now, there are lots of bars there, and I can talk endlessly about how exactly we studied this. I can also see that it's not very, at least for me here, it's not readable anymore. So I'm sorry for this. But the stuff in the bottom, that's the EMG, that's the physiological stuff in the face I showed you earlier on a slide. And the stuff above there uses different methodology, that is EEG, and that looks at particular areas of brain activity. And the bottom line of what you see here is that our responses to politicians are very different than our responses to ordinary people. That's one. Second is that we are very much obsessed by the out-party leader. So there's much more, there's more corrugator activity, the frowning activity, but there's also much more psychomaticus activity. So we even seem to smile if we see the out-party leader, especially if the out-party leader looks angry. That seems to make us very happy. And the interesting thing is then if you ask people if they're happy, they say no. Okay, so here we have this example of a distinction between what people say they feel and how their body is responding. Okay, now we get to a particular idea about polarization that concerns biology. So, this is 20 years ago, this famous paper appeared in Science, which made a very strong case for that there are deep-rooted biological differences between left-wing and right-wing people. And these differences have to do with our emotions. The argument is that ultimately right-wing people are much more sensitive to threats. They're more physiologically aroused by threats, and that, by consequence, leads them to support conservative political ideologies. And the reverse, liberals are less afraid, and therefore they attach themselves to liberal ideologies. And this is taking the conservative liberal translation from the US, so in the Netherlands you would say left-right. It's much more complicated than this, but that's a different talk. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple of nasty pictures, children. So we showed participants pictures like this. These are this is the operation of threat. And the best one. And then while participants were watching this, we were measuring their the arousal they experienced as measured with this activity in their fingertips, the sweat in their fingertips. And so what the original study found is that conservatives have more sweat on their fingertips when they watch these disgusting images than liberals do. And of course, the fact that this is a biological reason makes polarization solely much more problematic. Because if it is really biology that separates us, then it seems just much more difficult to bridge this. Right? Now the good news is that we conducted a very large replication study, and it doesn't replicate, meaning we did not find this particular effect. It looks very sexy, but apparently there is no difference between left-wing and right-wing people regarding their threat sensitivity. However, this is not the only biological argument that is made. There is one that is even more fundamental. There's another study conducted in about the same period that showed a difference in the size of the amygdala between liberals and conservatives. And the amygdala is, well, among other things, responsible for processing fear. So it seems to be a very related argument. And also we tried to replicate that study with many more people. So here's the Kanai et al. Was the original study. But it was done with very, very few people. And another great way to measure ideology. We ultimately replicated this study with 928 people. And to my own surprise, because this was done after this study about threat sensitivity, I had expected to be finally able to debunk the biological differences between left and right arguments. To my surprise, we find the same outcome. The amygdala of conservative people is larger than of liberal people. And here, children, I need your help. Because we're going to show you how large the difference is. Okay? We had one volunteer and we chipped a part of his brain. Come here. It's very heavy here. So, guys, ga me laten zien. Kom, doe mee. Ga me laten zien. And so we chipped this part from someone's brain and he turned from left to right. He suddenly became more... No, sorry, it's of course the other way around. We chipped this from his brain and we turned from right to left. It's supposed to be a sesame seed, what you're seeing. So there's one sesame seed difference on average between left and right people. And the question is then, of course, how large is the amygdala? 133 sesame seeds on average. And this is the difference. Do we know what that means? We don't have an idea. There may be millions of neurons in that sesame seed. Could be. But we have no idea what this really means. So even though we replicate this effect, and it is a bizarre effect, because if you take a variable that is much more mundane, like personality, there are very clearly distinguishable personality differences between people. And yes, there are people who are more fearful than other people, but we don't find this variable to correlate with amygdala size. So it's a very strange finding we have here that is, on the one hand, super sexy. We published this, the whole right-wing media jumps on top of it. They're like, see, there is a biological difference between these left-wing people. They have undeveloped amygdalas. It's interesting, the left-wing media ignored it completely. Except The Guardian, who wrote about it, but it was more like a meta-reflection. They wrote about how right-wing media were again picking up on this stupid biological differences argument. But ultimately, my point is here that although there is a difference, we don't know what it means. And it's completely overinterpreted in the media. This biological difference argument is extremely popular. There are a number of popular science books. There's actually coming out one very soon. The New York Times had already an interview with the author about a book called The Ideological Brain. And again there, this finding is one of the underpinnings of it. Okay, thank you. Oh yeah, I promised very briefly also to talk about. So this was one of the myths. There's a biological difference between the left and the right. Another myth is that the right is much more negative in their emotional communication, in the way they try to appeal to your emotions. And this is actually something we analyzed using computational social science techniques. So there are all these parliaments, more and more, they're opening up their archives, and so they place in all the debates there, and they make the machine readable. So you can go out easily and find, for example, 7 different countries where you have access to all of their debates from 1980 to now. And for some of them, you can go back even further than that. And then you can simply analyze, is there a difference between left-wing and right-wing politicians in how negative their speech is? And negativity you can then measure, for example, using a technique called sentiment analysis. This is basically a dictionary of words that are associated with negative emotions, such as anger and fear, etc. And what we find in this study is that the right is not more negative than the left. Actually, it differs per country and it differs over time. There's not a systematic difference between the left and the right. The only systematic thing we've found across all of these different countries, and this is really the most surprising finding we've ever had, is that opposition parties are more negative than government parties. Yes, that's what they're supposed to do. Criticize the government. So this is another myth of left and right differences, of so-called ideological asymmetries that actually, although lots of people have wrote about it and give speeches about it, it's not true. Okay, so far on polarization, and then I also promised to talk about populism a bit. And populism is probably the most abused scientific concept in the media and in politics, because almost every time it is not used to describe what it actually means. As scientists, we're supposed to make impact. Well, in establishing a scientific definition of populism, we've completely failed to have any sort of impact because we're systematically ignored by everyone. So, for you, maybe some of you are familiar with it already. Let's talk about what the definition of populism is, the scientific definition. There are three elements: anti-elitism, people-centrism, and a host ideology. So populism can be defined as a thin ideology, a thin set of connected ideas that are, on the one hand, about anti-elitism. So there's an elite out there that is corrupt and they're abusing their position and they're making use of us. And that's bad. Yeah? People-centrism is the idea that if we make democratic decisions, the people should be central, which is a bit fake, but it is essentially anti-pluralist, right? So it doesn't acknowledge the liberal aspect of democracy that, minorities have rights to. And then it attaches itself to a host ideology. So populism can be left-wing or right-wing or centrist, can be anything. And what I'm going to argue is that populism, we've seen populism as the enemy, as dangerous, at least in mainstream discourse. But there's not much danger in populism itself. The danger is in the host ideology. I think that's where, if anything, there is a problem. How populism is used as a term in popular discourse is very often has nothing to do with these three things, but people describe it as almost equivalent to emotions. Populism is emotional, and it's simplistic. And yes, on average, if you would do the same analysis I've shown you before, look at speeches of politicians, you would find that speeches of populist politicians are somewhat more emotional than speeches of mainstream politicians. But it's not their defining feature, right? Mainstream politicians can also give emotional speeches. And maybe they should do this more often. And the same is true for simplicity. Also, mainstream politicians can be quite simplistic. And we had this particular problem when we were trying to do this research where we wanted to measure what people's emotional responses are to populism. So basically the same setup as research I presented earlier. So where you had people in a lab and we had this physiological measurement equipment glued to their faces, and we asked them questions about what sort of emotions they felt. And so we needed to create treatments. First, a populist treatment. That turned out to be very easy. This was our populist treatment, at least the text. So there's also a video that comes with it, but this is just the text. So, and it's translated, it was originally in Dutch, of course. So it sounds a bit weird, maybe. So it's the political elite in The Hague does exactly the reverse of what the people want. So that's anti-elitism. This happens time after time. When they are elected, they know that for 4 years they can do whatever they want. And the people they ignore. So that's the people-centrism. Politicians should be deeply ashamed. It's time for change. Away with the... So here there's no host ideology, and that's on purpose. And this is also the difficulty of studying populism, because it always has a host ideology, be it right-wing or left-wing, etc. To measure people's responses to it, we're not only measuring people's responses to populism, but also to left-wing ideology. And so here we try to circumvent that by not talking about any host ideology. Now, the problem we encountered came next. What is the opposite of populism? How would you formulate this? And we spent a lot of time thinking about this, and we came up with a treatment that I think was really bad. I will show it to you. Here. On a daily basis, our representatives in The Hague are confronted with big social issues. Of course, they have different opinions about how these problems need to be solved. But by, oh, there's a word missing, but by working hard and putting the interests of the Dutch people first, they can bridge these differences. We can be proud of the good work of our representatives. Who believes this? This would be pro-elitism. But, I mean, this has no resonance at all. In fact, in the experiment we conducted, this second treatment had the strongest emotional response, because people thought it was bizarre. So, but then we have kind of a problem, right? If at least if you think populism is a problem, then you know, what would be, if we can't define what the anti-populism would look like, or if we can't define it in a way that is also appealing, yeah, then there is a bit of a problem. But then again, I would say, is populism really the problem here, or the host ideology? So talking about debunking myths, one of the myths is populism is a problem. Did I have a next slide? No. Some of the populism, especially its anti-elitist aspect, is actually not a problem at all, I would say, in democracy, because we need critique of the elite. And in fact, we know from empirical research that if there's no change in government for a long period, that corruption increases dramatically. So, to a large extent, anti-elitist critique is almost always true. Yes, there is a political elite in The Hague, and yes, many of them are there for their own interest, not for yours, regardless of political color. And yes, some of them should indeed be deeply ashamed. And in fact, some of the populist critique isn't even all that dramatic. When Thierry Baudet, for example, from Forum for Democracy, gave his maiden speech. Okay, there was first a part in Latin, I didn't get that part, but then he continued to talk about cartel parties. So the political parties in The Hague form a cartel, and they wouldn't let anybody else in. This is not a, in fact, what we teach first-year students in political science in the very first course that they get. The cartel party theory is an established theory of parties in political science, that over time, these political parties, they try to limit competition by, for example, using the state to finance themselves, to limiting access to outsiders. And so this is not at all a dramatic new vision of democracy that he was presenting. It was actually very mainstream. And so, again, my problem is not with this anti-elitism, but what comes with it. Because ultimately, this anti-elitism is a very effective rhetorical strategy that plays into people's feelings of inequality aversion, as economists call it, or reverse dominance, as anthropologists call it. And I would just simply say, we don't like it when people are abusing their position of power. And this is a very effective rhetorical strategy, and to which people probably have strong emotional responses to, but I haven't established that yet. And so we should be very aware when people use these strategies, not for what they're saying about the elite, but for what comes with this. So the host ideology they bring in, which in its current shape is of course mostly a host ideology of right-wing authoritarianism or extreme right politics, whatever label you want to put on it. Okay, my kids drank my water. Oh no, here it is. Yes. Okay, so let me talk briefly about political alexithymia. What do we really feel? I started studying emotions in 2015, 2016, and at the time there were all these newspapers that were talking about how angry citizens or fearful citizens were either voting for Brexit or voting for Trump, voting for Le Pen, voting for Wilders. There was this whole sort of domino theory of how every country would turn populist one by one. But what particularly triggered me was this idea of evoking these emotion words leading to certain behaviors. Particularly if you say anger and fear led to the same thing. Angry citizens voted for Brexit, and fearful citizens too. But according to emotion theory, anger and fear have quite different consequences, right? So fearful people, I already mentioned this, are more likely to search for information. So it didn't make sense at all that fearful people would vote for Brexit. Angry people are more likely to act out of their disposition, so they're not going to search for more information. In fact, they're going to do the opposite. They're going to do what they already think was true. And so this led me to think about these emotion labels. Do we actually, if we say we're angry about something or fearful about something, what do we really mean? And particularly if we talk about politics, because emotions in the personal sphere, I mean, we live them directly. They're much more diverse. There's less of a hierarchy. But political emotions, we almost always, we experience something that is very far from us, typically. Americans, for example, who live in Pennsylvania are very concerned about immigration on the southern border, but they're never there. They've never been there. They don't see this. Same is true here in the Netherlands, of course. We talk about immigration. It's not as if we're standing at the airport and seeing them all walk in, or we're standing at the border and we're seeing them crossing. No. At best, we go to Ter Apel and we see it's pretty busy over there. Unemployment is also something like we get very concerned if the unemployment is rising, but most of us are not unemployed. And so, in contrast to personal emotions, I don't know, like breaking up with your partner, I mean, that's very personal, right? So that's very direct, right there. But we use those same words for describing something that is very close to us as compared to something that's very distant and mediated. People also tell us what we should feel about politics. Yeah. So how do we make sense of all of this? Now, as a very first basic step, what we've researched is emotion theories describe how appraisals of the situation, so basically evaluations of a situation, lead to specific emotions. So do we find a situation very certain or uncertain? Do we think that there's no human control over the situation, or there's just situational control? Do we see someone who's clearly responsible for something, or we don't know who's responsible? All these different appraisals lead us to different sorts of emotions. So for example, if a situation is very certain, there's very clearly a responsible actor, and there's clearly human control, then we get angry, right? So to use the Cluedo, I don't know, you know that board game, Cluedo? It's like, okay, it was the waiter with the chandelier in the kitchen, right? Okay, so then we get angry. But if we don't have these appraisals, we have different versions of it, we might experience a different emotion, such as fear or disgust, etc. Our question was, are we good at describing our emotions in this way? So we appraise a situation and then we label the emotion we have. If you ask this to people in the personal domain, then we're pretty capable of predicting the emotion you said that you had based on how you've appraised the situation. So let's say in 7 out of 10 times, we're correctly predicting the emotion you've had. But if we ask people to describe an emotion they felt about politics, and then they need to appraise the situation and give us their emotion label, so then we try to predict the emotion label they gave from these appraisals. Again, the same way as we did with the personal emotions. And suddenly, we're not able to predict emotions anymore. In fact, well, at best we could determine whether people had a positive or a negative emotion. But we were not able anymore to distinguish whether people were angry, fearful, disgusted, contented. And so we still all use all these words in media and also in research to describe emotions people have about politics, but in fact people can't even distinguish whether they were angry or fearful. Right? And this is why I've called this political alexithymia. Perhaps we're not that capable of expressing our feelings in politics. And this is just the beginning of this research agenda. Now we're doing lots of focus group conversations with people. And lots of people simply say, yeah, can't do anything about it. I feel bad about it, but what can I do? Who am I? And so they sense a real, they sense powerlessness. Right? And yeah, what are the emotions associated with powerlessness? Well, depends a bit on the other evaluations you have of the situation, but ultimately it's not good, because it leads people to retreat from the process. It could be associated with emotions such as sadness. And so it leads people to become politically disinterested and inactive. And these are, of course, bad outcomes that emotions have on democracy. Because we want people to participate, we want people to be interested and think about politics. And so our question is, how can we re-regulate their emotions, make them reappraise the situation in order to get them motivated again and take political action. All right, I think I'm at the... Yeah, so how can we use emotions? This is the end of the last three slides of the presentation. If you ask people, what sort of emotions do you want politicians to use? Overwhelmingly, they want politicians to use more positive emotions. That's what this slide shows. So on the left, you see the negative emotions: anger, disgust, fear, sad, contempt. And people really want less of that. And on the right, you see enthusiasm, hope, and pride. People want more of this. This is not, there's no left-right difference. Even people from the most radical right-wing parties in the Netherlands want this. Even Republicans in the United States want this. This is a almost universal pattern in the two countries I've researched. And it really struck me how strong this bias towards more positive emotions is. And so how can we use emotion? Well, let's first start using more positive language is the very first step. I had this clicker. Where did I leave it? Oh, here. Yes. We've talked to high school teachers, people who teach maatschappijleer in Dutch, civic studies in English. It's like, and we've asked them like things about how's the atmosphere, politically speaking, in your classroom, and they all say there's a lot of polarization around different political themes in the classroom, and that in teaching that they try to emphasize the importance of emotions in politics, but they also indicate overwhelmingly that they don't have any materials that helps them to integrate how to use emotions in politics. And so, thinking back about the maatschappijleer I had, this was basically about the constitution, right? The formal working of government. But it doesn't prepare you as a citizen how to listen, how to cope with very emotional people, and respond to them in an effective way. I'm not saying, and it's an effective way, I'm not saying you can't use emotions. Right? I think this is very often what people tell youngsters. I always have to think about a few years ago you had these school children who went on strike for the climate strikes. And they were overwhelmingly told by much, much older people, it's like, go back to school, you don't know enough and you're too emotional. And so these kids were angry, but they had the right to be angry. Right? We're destroying their future. Of course they can be angry. And what we've done, we've told them they were stupid. They're too emotional. Go back to school and learn how to use your emotions and engage in rational politics. What did this do to them? They became super sad. They're all at home now, Netflixing. Some of you are here. Great to see you. And so this is, of course, something we need to prevent. And of course, one of the clearest way to do this is to do interventions at high schools. This is also something we're working on currently. And so how can we use emotions? I've talked about emotion regulation. I didn't talk about political mental health, but this is also an issue in the Netherlands. It relates closely to what I just mentioned about the climate strike people. But on average, 11% of the Netherlands, of the Dutch population, indicates to have issues like stress or depression when thinking about politics. And so this is a super high number, and this is really bad, because bad mental health leads to depression, sadness, etc. Retracting behavior, not engaging in politics, not being disinterested. And so this is quite a large proportion of the people who can be diagnosed in this way. Collective effervescence, okay, that's a very difficult word, but what I mean with this is that I think in politics it's become all too individualistic, especially if you compare it to politics in the 50s or 60s, which had a much more collective nature of literally collective as gathering together in places and living politics. This is becoming rarer and rarer. And there's an important emotional argument in here, because together experiencing something, the emotions we experience there, they are more contagious. So you are affecting your neighbors. And then if there's a good gathering, of course, then you can become more enthusiastic than you would have been if you would have seen the same information on social media or just on television or reading about it in a newspaper. Now, the last point I want to make is putting the passion back into liberalism. And I mean support for liberal democracy here, not right-wing politics. But I asked my students in a class called Emotions in Politics, it's a master level course I teach at the University of Amsterdam. I asked them to write an emotional political speech. And they could choose the host ideology, so to say. So they could choose which political party or entity they wrote the speech for. And they all ended up writing speeches with a radical right nature. And I was really surprised by this, because my students are not radical right students. This is the University of Amsterdam. 40% votes for the Animal Rights Party. Now that's putting it too much. 30% votes for the Animal Rights Party, 30% votes for Green Left and Labour, and then the rest votes for small left-wing parties. And sometimes there's a student from the VVD. So I asked them, how come you've written a speech for parties you don't agree with? Why did you do this? And why did you all do exactly the same thing? Yeah, now that I'm thinking about this again, they probably just gave ChatGPT a prompt, but their answer was as follows. They said, they are the only ones giving emotional speeches. And that really, really saddened me. I again also had to think a bit about us free researchers not being able to write an emotionally arousing, pro-elitist text. I think we've lost a bit, we as in the political center, have lost a bit the passion for passions, the passion for emotions, the passion for writing an emotional speech just to support left-wing politics or right-wing politics, but not extremist politics. And I think this is a terrible diagnosis, because the others are doing this, and they're doing it well. And so I think the question is not, is politics too emotional, not emotional enough? If some are only using emotions and the other ones refuse it, then emotions become a dead weight in, not a dead weight. Emotions become a problem in democracy. But they need not be a problem. We can use emotions, and we've done so, the political center has done so in the past. And it's just about reinventing that. And I think that will definitely benefit democracy. I want to end with emphasizing that I haven't done all this research alone. Hot Politics Lab was already mentioned. And so this is really a team science collaborative effort. And so I want to thank all the people in this picture, which is sort of the current team, and the people in this picture, which is the old team. And I want to thank my two research assistants here. Well done. Goed gedaan, man. Je was helemaal stil. And you've been a lovely audience, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Gijs Schumacher. Let's kick off right off the bat. Does anyone have a question? You can think about it a little bit. Here I see some hands slowly raising.
So thank you. And at the end you state that the political center has lost its way in using emotions in expressing itself. Do you have a feeling on when this happened and how this happened?
Well, that would be a great question for an historian. There's a there's a book that makes this argument in the context of the United States. It's written by Drew Weston in the 2006 or something, and there's no historical component per se to it. He just goes back a few election campaigns to argue that one side in the United States isn't embracing the emotions enough. But for him, it's not necessarily the center versus the extremes, but rather the Democrats versus the Republicans, which by now has become the center versus the extreme. But okay, this wasn't the case in 2006. And so this very much supported, this was one argument in line with this ideological asymmetry argument that I've talked about, that there's a difference between left and right. And we ultimately find that not to be true, right? So, but our analysis only go back to 1980s. So it may have been true before that. I'm not sure. But I've done some archival work at one point. I looked at Dutch speeches in the 1950s of party leaders at party congress. So not in parliament, but in party congress speeches. And boy, they were emotional and radical and talking about polarization. I mean, how the Catholics talked about labor and the other way around. Yeah, that was interesting. So ultimately, I don't think this is a really fundamental, I can't really pinpoint the point in time when they've lost this. I don't know. No.
Right. Thank you for the question. I saw some more hands here.
I had, maybe it's more of a reflection, and then you can give your comments about political alexithymia, because from I'm in my last year of university, and I study international relations, and among my peers, I see a huge trend of them studying political science, not keeping up with the news or what's happening in the world because it's so negative. And because of what you were talking about with political mental health, I don't see that that's addressed. And it's really impacting even students who are supposed to be knowledgeable about what's going on in the world currently. So what I was thinking of is how we're being fed so much information, and that forms our opinions, not because we came to that conclusion ourselves, but because maybe it's a news outlet that we trust that has phrased something in a particular way, and we associate that phrasing with a particular emotion, or it evokes a specific emotion in us. And I feel like that might be a reason why some people aren't able to define how they feel about a specific political instance, or just their reactions in general to what's happening in the world. And I feel like if you ask them to go on a deeper level, they wouldn't be able to explain themselves because it was something that was spoon-fed to them. And I was wondering if you ever dove into this in your studies or in your research.
I think one thing that came to mind when you were talking is that there's of course a very close connection to the information we get and how we respond to this, because in this information, the framing of the information, this contains these appraisals that I've talked about earlier. For example, who did it, who's responsible, how controllable is the situation, is this a morally wrong or right chain of actions and decisions. And so we're basically told how to appraise the situation, and so this stimulates us to feel in a particular way. That's definitely true. But you also said something different about students avoiding the news, right? And I think this is a slightly different phenomenon. So we have people who are indeed being spoon-fed, and they believe it all, and they just replicate the news that they've been spoon-fed. But the people who don't want to, who avoid the news, I think these are different. This is sort of different psychological mechanism that they've become really disappointed. For example, with the climate strike, or a similar mechanism. Or they've experienced something like information overload, especially too many different voices at the same time, and they just don't know anymore what to make of it, and they don't have the capabilities, they haven't been taught the capabilities to negotiate this. And this might be more problematic in these times because there's indeed much more information from a lot of different sources. In fact, interestingly, our information diet in the past was much poorer. So you could see this as a good thing, that our information diet these days is richer simply because we have access to more sources. But it doesn't necessarily always lead for everyone to a better outcome. No. I hope this addresses your reflections.
Are there some questions on this side still? I'll go the other side.
Hi, good evening.
Hi.
You mentioned the climate strikes, and I was wondering, when it comes to the climate change discourse, it's clearly lost momentum. I mean, at least since 2019, I think it's lost a bit of its appeal, maybe. Mostly, you look at the most recent election results, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that to gain momentum back, the climate change discourse should be more emotional, should tap more into emotions? Or on the contrary, because it's also a scientific reality that is based on a lot of rational facts, is it difficult to introduce emotions into this debate? How do you think we can sort of rally more people around this issue?
Well, if only I knew the answer to this question. Well, I think with climate change, I think we can consider the fact that emphasizing the rational aspects of the case, the factual aspects of the case hasn't really worked at all. And I wonder whether the communication that's been attempted by various organizations in the climate movement, I wonder if it is the message the problem, or the strategy the problem, and particularly how these organizations are embedded in society, and the lack of connection between them and the companies that need to do this, that need to change their way of producing in order to reduce our carbon footprint. I find it. I don't think the message here is the problem. I think it's rather the political integration of the movement. But this is more as talking as a civilian than as someone who has researched this particular topic. Yeah.
Over here.
Thank you. You talked about the distance between politics and people, yes, and that makes emotions a little bit unclear.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think you have a point on that.
Mm-hmm.
But it makes this distance it possible to reinterpret your emotions and to verdringen your emotions.
Yeah. To reappraise them, reduce them, push them aside.
Push them aside.
Yep.
Yes. And perhaps I can give climate change as example.
Yeah.
Because you have a huge discussion on climate change, but there are two things I never hear. Yes, first is that nuclear energy has no problems with climate change, so it's not CO2 using. The Greens never mentioned that. And the second I want to emphasize is that war is very CO2 producing, is very bad for climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but the Greens are just for the war in Ukraine, for example.
Mm-hmm.
They just say, "Oh, let's send more weapons to Ukraine."
Mm-hmm.
So if you are not consequent in your goals, in what you want and what you emotionally want, and to realize it, well, then your emotions get stuck, I guess.
Mm.
Can you respond to this?
Look, politics. I'm not going to defend choices of political parties. That's not my job. But of course, politics is very complicated, and there's never only one principle that people, or even if they would have only one principle, that even could lead to quite different policy decisions in a range of different areas. And I think this is the emotional labor of the political elite, of a politician, that you need to negotiate these different decisions you need to make. And then there's also a lot of short-term, long-term evaluations in here, that sometimes you need to say yes to something to achieve something in that doesn't seem good in the short term, but maybe good in the long term, or the other way around. This is of course extremely hard, and this is why being a politician is also a very stressful job. Ultimately, as a citizen, you have the same issues, of course. This is what we call being cross-pressured. So you think something of war, for example, you think it is an inviolable right of a country not to be invaded. That might be one of your principles, right? And at the same time, you think climate change is really one of the largest problems in the world, or the largest problem in the world. And so then you might become conflicted about what your stance should be on Ukraine. And this is indeed a deeply emotional process, and it's definitely not easy to negotiate this. Yeah, and this leads to stress, and some people would even say, "Well, it just becomes too difficult, and I opt out of it. Fuck it all." Hashtag.
Thank you. Next question here.
Thank you for the lecture. I was curious about the statistics that you showed about positive and negative emotions, and that people wish politics become more positive.
Yeah.
However, as far as we see on practice, there is more appeal to negative ones,
Yeah.
and usually it's more considered effective to be, and that negative emotions more lead to stick to your political opinion and so on. That leads me to the idea that maybe people want to have less pressure emotionally in some way, even they're more telling about they want positive emotions, because they don't want emotions on high level. And I want, maybe know your opinion on the fact that even people cannot switch emotions. We can have different levels of them. And do you think it's important to regulate emotions on the moderate, simple way, or it doesn't matter?
Mm-hmm. There are a lot of different layers in this question, and let me talk about something that I haven't talked about, which builds on this finding that positive emotions are preferred. We also did a decision-making experiment with people where we kept on showing them 2 election posters. And so on these election posters, they saw unknown politicians who were smiling or looking angry. They also had a slogan, and the slogan was also positive or negative. And so with this experiment, you randomly see something, right? So it could be negative one, a positive one, etc. And so with this experiment, we can establish what the effect is of smiling compared to looking angry or looking neutral. And we can establish the effect of a positive tone of your language versus a neutral or negative tone. And what we find is quite overwhelmingly in a whole bunch of different studies is that positive tone and positive, happy expressions do better than their neutral or negative counterparts. But then we come back to the little crumb that my children showed. How large is that effect? it's a little bit larger than a breadcrumb, but it's only 4%. A politician becomes 4% more popular if they smile. So that also means there are lots of people who think it's okay to look angry or to have a neutral expression. And then with such small differences, it becomes turnout, like who is stimulated to turn out for elections becomes an issue. And like for any election in Western Europe, only 70 to 80% shows up. That means 20% stays home. And this 20% is not a random group of people. These are people who typically opt out of politics. And so there are people who find politics too negative because of all the debates and the blah, blah, blah. And so they opt out of politics. And so then actually the population effect might be that negative politics works better because the positive people have stayed home. I don't know if that's true, but that's a possible explanation of this. Yeah. At the same time, I think we also, especially in the Netherlands, we also very often forget that even though some party becomes the largest, it's the political center that is much larger. And so we could also talk about that and why 4 or 5 parties in the political center who want pretty much the same thing are still running as separate parties. That could also be the conversation. Yeah. And the last part of your question was about regulation. Yeah, I don't think I have a good answer to that yet. So. And there are a lot more fingers, so sorry.
Yeah, let's go to the last question here.
I have 2 questions, actually. So the first one is about what you were saying as well with negative emotions not being as popular in politics. But politicians are supposed to be making change or advocating change in a country. So how do you talk about, how do you balance talking about negative things in a country and not being too negative that you don't become popular as a politician?
Yeah. There's this great English expression that doesn't seem to come to mind right now, but it's something like eat your enemy with a smile. That's basically it. So I think, especially in facial displays, it's really important to smile. Yeah.
And then I was also wondering, with situations happening, for example, if you look at a war, for example, there's a lot of different emotions that you have when you look at it. And I was wondering what's the main emotion that drives people to come into action to actually do something about the problem. Is there a main one, or does it more depend on the situation and what's happening?
Anger is, of course, an emotion that is typically related to motivating people to get up and do something. But if I've learned anything about studying emotions, it's that these effects are often quite context dependent. And again, there's this disconnect between the physical activity and the verbal labeling of emotions. That's what I've talked about as well. I think in terms of wars, it's also very interesting how the framing of imagery that is being shown about the war and how that can stimulate people to come into action. And this imagery it's never really neutral in the sense that there may be sort of a one side where there's a victim and you see lots of people being very, very emotional, and then that is then juxtaposed with another side that is then perhaps looking much more calm and calculated. And these things have effects too. I think this is very important to also keep in mind when reading about and getting yourself informed about wars. It's like the emotional imagery that the media is trying to show. It's always, of course, like one moment.
Right, I've been notified that I've overlooked somebody the whole time. So the last question now.
I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. Thank you so much for your lectures, really insightful. I was really interested in one of the last parts you were mentioning, this collective effervescence, and sort of how we've become more individualistic, and that we, and also like learning something from other people versus social media. And I also read a paper I think you co-authored about loneliness and how that is positively associated with populist radical right support.
Yeah.
And I guess I was just wondering if you could tell a bit more about it, or if you have any recommendations, authors to read about this more, because I thought it was super, super interesting.
Thank you
so
much. So the word collective effervescence is not sure if it's introduced, but it's used a lot, at least, by a sociologist called Randall Collins. And so his idea is that emotions spread faster if you sit together with a group of people, experiencing, looking at the same thing. And he argues that this has a physiological reason, that if we are in close proximity to people, for example, our heart rates align, and our facial expressions come to align. And some people even find at the level of brain activity that there's more alignment. And so with this alignment basically strengthens the emotional experience compared to a situation that you've been experiencing the same thing but alone. I haven't done much research about this myself. It's one of my big ambitions to do this. There's one thing that I can mention that we did, which is really fascinating, that we did a field experiment a few years ago at the theater festival Oerol on the other side of the Netherlands, in Terschelling. And in this field experiment, people were walking towards a stage where they would see a theater play. But before they got there, they participated in our experiment. And in this experiment, they were read different versions of a news item. The news item had in common that it was about a civil war in Belgium, and that there was a new Belgian government, and it was a radical right government, and it had thrown out all of the non-Western people onto the Dutch border. And so, and then the story continues in different ways. So there's a sort of an empathy. It's like, oh, look at these poor people, treatment. There's also radical right treatment, the nativist treatments, like these people don't belong here. Now, what we were interested in is people's sympathy for refugees. And if at the Oerol Theater Festival, if we let them hear this nativist treatment, people actually had more empathy for refugees instead of less. So the message really sort of had an opposite effect. We did the same study with the same stimulus material and partially the same sort of people, but then online. That was the only difference. And we found the reverse effect. Now the nativist treatment motivated people to dislike immigrants. And interestingly, of the 5 other treatments we had, they were in the same direction in the online study as in the the field experiment. And so I find this really fascinating. I don't have an explanation for why this happened. It relates indeed vaguely to what you've mentioned about loneliness and radical right and etc. But this is really something I want to come back here in 5 years and talk about this. So see you there.
We'll keep you to that.
Yeah.
And thank you everybody for your questions and your presence. Thank you to the assistants. Thank you so much. You've done a great job. Please. Je kreeg applaus. Well, and love to see you next time. Thank you, and another applause for Gijs Schumacher.